You've probably seen the headlines. The top of the world is melting. And as that ice disappears, a whole new strategic corridor for global shipping is opening up. But what does that actually mean for the markets? Well, in this explainer, we're going to build a mental framework for how to think like an investor when you see these dramatic headlines about the Arctic, and how to separate the real signals from all the noise.
So what's happening here is pretty straightforward, but also kind of mind-blowing. Climate change is literally redrawing the world map right before our eyes. You know, for centuries, the Arctic was this massive frozen barrier. Impassable. Now, it's turning into a real navigable ocean for a few months every year. And this isn't some far-off prediction, folks. It's happening right now. And it's completely changing the game for global logistics, resource access, and, yeah, geopolitics.
And this is the number that you'll see everywhere, the one that grabs all the headlines, 40%. That's the promise, right? That the Northern Sea route could be up to 40% shorter than going all the way through the Suez Canal. Just think about that. We're talking about shaving 10, maybe even 15 days off a trip from Asia to Europe. It's a huge, compelling figure, and it's the engine driving all the hype we're about to dig into.
Okay, so here's how we're going to break it all down. We'll look at the thawing frontier, this new great game that's playing out, separate the hype from the real hurdles, and pinpoint the actual market risks. Then we'll cover some common investor mistakes and wrap up with how to think about this stuff not in days, but in decades. All right, first up, the thawing frontier. So let's get the basic picture straight. We are literally watching a new ocean appear on the map. I mean, the projections are pretty clear. Within a couple of decades, the Arctic could be almost totally ice-free in the summer. And this is bigger than just one new shipping lane. We're talking about a fundamental change in who can go where at the very top of our planet. So naturally, as these new sea lanes started opening up, you can bet the world's major powers started moving in to stake their claims. People love to call it a new Cold War, and you can see why. But really, it's more of a long-term strategic chess match than some kind of immediate showdown. So let's meet the players.
For Russia, this is a really big deal. The Northern Sea Route runs right along their massive Arctic coastline, and it's just absolutely critical for them. It's doing two big things. First, it's their highway for exporting all the oil, gas, and minerals they're pulling out of their Arctic territories. And second, it's a maritime corridor that lets them pivot their entire economy towards the east, to build stronger ties with Asia and especially with China.
And then, of course, there's China. This is just a brilliant bit of geopolitical marketing, really. China has zero territory in the Arctic, right? So what do? They just declared themselves a near-Arctic state. It sounds so official, doesn't it? But it's a title they completely made up for themselves. And they're not just talking. Beijing is backing it up with serious cash, investing in icebreakers, new partnerships. It's all part of their bigger Polar Silk Road plan to get access to all those new resources and shipping routes. So, how did the West respond to all this? Well, they've really circled the wagons. With Finland now in NATO, you have 7 out of the 8 official Arctic nations all in the same club. And what that does is, it basically splits the Arctic right down the middle. You've got Russia, which is becoming more and more dependent on China on one side, and then you have this big block of NATO allies on the other. It's really sharpened the whole competition up there. Okay, part 3, hype versus hurdles. So let's step away from the big picture geopolitical chessboard for a minute. Let's get down to the practical, on-the-water reality of actually trying to sail a ship through the Arctic. Because this is where that shiny promise we talked about crashes headfirst into some very cold, very harsh realities.
And this right here, this is probably the most important thing to understand. The hype makes it sound like we're about to get a new global superhighway, but the reality, it's not that at all. The data is super clear. Something like 99% of the ships on that Northern Sea Route are what's called destination traffic. So what does that mean? It means it's not giant container ships taking a shortcut. Nope. It's Russian ships carrying Russian resources from the Arctic out to the rest of the world. It's a resource export route, not a global transit lane.
Yeah, this chart just lays out the whole trade-off perfectly. Look, the top 2 lines, the Arctic route wins, hands down. It's shorter, it's faster, no argument there. But then you look at the bottom 2 lines, and that's where the whole story kind of falls apart. The Suez Canal, it's open all year round and has tons of infrastructure. The Arctic route, it's only open for a few months, and there's, well, not much of anything up there. And for today's supply chains, which are all about just-in-time delivery, that kind of unpredictability is just a total deal breaker. And it's not even just about the season being short. I mean, just try to picture it. You're trying to navigate a massive ship through floating chunks of unpredictable ice. There's nowhere to refuel or get repairs for thousands of miles. Oh, and your insurance costs are through the roof, plus you have to pay Russia for a mandatory icebreaker escort. I love this analogy. The Suez Canal is like a perfectly paved 12-lane superhighway with a service station every few miles. The Arctic, it's like a beautiful, scenic country road that's only open in the summer and, by the way, has no emergency services.
And this image, wow, it just perfectly captures the huge environmental and operational risk. They call it the response gap. In a place this remote and this harsh, if something goes wrong, say an oil spill, your ability to actually respond is almost zero. An accident that you could manage in the Atlantic Ocean could become an absolute ecological disaster in the Arctic that lasts for years. And you can bet that's a risk that insurance companies and shipping lines are taking very, very seriously.
All right, Section 4, the real market risks. So if we've established that the risk isn't some sudden war breaking out or global trade getting turned upside down overnight, what are the risks an investor should actually be paying attention to? Well, we have to look past the drama and focus on the slower, more fundamental stuff. Okay, so the real risks here aren't the ones you see in the headlines. They're much slower, more structural. Things like cost uncertainty. What happens to your business model if Russia decides to double the fees for its icebreakers? Or regulatory risk. What if new environmental rules say you can't use a certain type of cheap fuel in the Arctic anymore? And maybe the biggest one of all, infrastructure risk. I mean, who is going to front the hundreds of billions of dollars to build ports and stuff in the middle of nowhere? And how can they ever be sure they'll get that money back? Okay, number 5, common investor mistakes. Now that we have a better handle on the reality of the situation, we can talk about how to avoid some of the really common traps people fall into when they hear those big, dramatic headlines about the Arctic. So let's tackle the big one first. You hear about military bases, new warships. The natural question is this Arctic Cold War something that could blow up and hit the markets tomorrow? And the first mistake is right there, confusing this long-term strategic game with some kind of immediate threat. Look, both sides are absolutely setting up their pieces on the board. They're building up bases, running exercises, but you have to see it for what it is, a very, very slow-moving chess game that will play out over decades. It is not the prelude to a sudden war that's going to tank the market next week.
Okay, on to the next big question, the one you always see when some shipping company sends one boat through the ice as a test run. Is this it? Is this the moment global trade changes forever?
And that brings us to mistake number 2, just completely underestimating how long this stuff takes. A headline about one ship making the trip, that flashes around the world in a second. But building the actual deep water ports, the search and rescue stations, all the things you need for real large-scale shipping, that takes decades and hundreds of billions of dollars. The simple truth is that headlines travel a whole lot faster than concrete and steel. So if we're trying to avoid those mistakes, what is the right way to think about all this? Well, that brings us to our last section, how to build a calm, structured way to think about the Arctic, and to think about it in decades. The best way to look at this is through the lens of a structural theme. What's that? It just means it's not a short-term trade. It's not something you buy and sell based on the news of the day. It's a really slow-moving, powerful trend that plays out over decades. Think about the rise of online shopping or the shift to clean energy. The Arctic is one of those. It's a story that will slowly reshape our world over a very, very long time. So here's the bottom line. You've basically got 2 different timelines you're watching. There's the noisy day-to-day news cycle that's jumping all over the place, and then there's the slow, steady, powerful structural trend underneath it all. The goal as an investor is not to try and guess the next move in the news cycle. It's to find a way to calmly get some exposure to that big long-term shift and to separate that long story from the short-term noise. And of course, I have to say, this has been a framework to help you think through risk. It is definitely not financial advice. If you're looking for more calm, structured ways to make sense of the markets, please do subscribe. Thanks so much for watching.